Hi, this is a lecture on anarchism, on Lucy Parsons, Emma Goldman, and Peter Kropotkin, and writings from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, probably starting around 1880, 1885, and extending up until, I'm not sure when that Goldman text was written, could be the early 19 teens. So this is a period where Kropotkin's the oldest figure, and he was a Russian prince to begin with, but heavily involved in uprisings in Europe, which is kind of the same scene that we were looking at when we looked at Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Lucy Parsons was born in Texas, and she was involved in labor organizing. She was an American anarchist from the 1870s up till almost 1940. And then Emma Goldman, I think, is basically the youngest of this group, although all these people knew one another, and she became prominent in the early 1900s as a labor organizer. The two women here, Lucy Parsons and Emma Goldman. Lucy Parsons was one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. IWW members are also called Wobblies, and the Wobblies were a really important union in the early 1900s and sort of brought down to almost nothing in the run-up to World War II, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, but it still exists, and it's sort of gotten rebuilt out of the anti-globalization movement in the late 1990s. So Lucy Parsons was one of the founders. So this is 1905. A black woman was among the founders of this union. That was a rare thing for a union at that time. I'm going to start with Parsons, and then I'm going to move on to Goldman, and then I'm going to go on to Kropotkin. This is not correct chronologically. Oh, and by the way, Parsons hung out with Peter Kropotkin. They did speaking engagements together. Parsons and Goldman knew one another, but they were adversaries in a lot of ways, primarily because Lucy Parsons systematically emphasized class relations, and she thought that all organizing effort ought to be economically based and oppose class relations, whereas Emma Goldman agreed about the problems with these relationships, but she also thought that an anarchist mentality, which she deeply felt had to do with freedom. Anarchism is about freedom. Goldman also talked a lot about women's issues and about sexuality, and about the right of people, and women in particular, to have free sexual relationships. She was opposed to marriage. She thought marriage constituted a variety of servitude. So because they had this different emphasis, and Goldman really startled a whole lot of people, even within the labor movement, who still held on to standard traditional bourgeois values having to do with marriage and chastity and the place of men and women. So Goldman pushed in this direction, Lucy pushed in the other direction, and they thought that each thought the other was working somewhat in the wrong direction. Nevertheless, these are some of the most influential anarchists in the history of the world. Let's start with Parsons. She was apparently a really good speaker, very powerful speaker, and the one that I had you read was a speech that was published in, I think, a Kansas newspaper in 1886, maybe. And in this text, and then in the following one, she basically diagnoses the current situation as she sees it from an anarchist perspective. So I'll just give you like her basic points here, and then I'll move on to Goldman. So our basic idea is to introduce anarchism sort of as a whole. Now, there are all kinds of anarchists, and there are different varieties. There are anarchists who focus primarily on individual freedom. There's a lot of overlap between anarchism and libertarianism, which is a fact, but something that neither libertarians nor anarchists really appreciate, because they share a whole lot of principles, but they differ on some very important principles as well. So I'm giving you some classic anarchism here, but it's not all of it. The thing to know about anarchism also is that, anarchism was contemporary. The rise of anarchism as we now know it was contemporary with the rise of Marxism. Maybe I should back up a little bit and say, well, historically, if you open your lens wide enough, if you're somewhat loose in your interpretation of what constitutes anarchism. So anarchism could be radical egalitarian relationships, radical direct democracy, opposition to hierarchy, opposition to the growth of a state structure, which means absence of a standing army, absence of a police force, absence of a prison system. And now this all might be starting to sound utopian to y'all, but it's not. And that's not just my opinion. It's not utopian because it's actually existed. So utopian means like imaginary, right? These are things that have really existed. If you look at the Iroquois nation, they were harsh in a whole bunch of ways and militaristic, but they didn't have a police force. They didn't have a prison system. They didn't have a judicial system. They didn't need it. So if you really look through the history of the world, you'll find actually the vast majority of human societies have probably been closer to anarchism than to anything else, especially if you recognize that, what we think of as civilization emerges maybe 6,000 years ago, but humans in their present anatomical and cognitive format have been around for like 200,000 years. So the vast majority of time that humans have lived, they have lived without state structures, and they have lived without exploitative labor, and they have lived without concentrated urban living systems. They have lived in small groups instead of in big ones. And these are all, very generally speaking, things that are recommended by anarchists, which is not to say that anarchists are primitivist. Anyway, the variety of anarchism that we are looking at now arises in Europe, and the philosophy, this particular variety of the philosophy of anarchism, is nurtured and developed in Europe on the basis of European philosophy, including people like Rousseau, but also including important people like Hegel, who we're not covering in this class. Anyway, so Lucy Parsons becomes one of these people, famous one. 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. In Europe, there's all this turbulence going on. 1848 was this massive year of revolts, but then we have the Paris Commune in 1871, and there's this large-scale organization of radical workers, which is growing. That's called the First International, and then there's a Second International. And this is important to know about Marx, too. Marx and Engels were not just armchair theorists. They were heavily involved in real organizing. They were involved in real revolutionary activities. They really went to jail. They really were exiled from one and another nation. But the other thing to know is that as those large-scale international organizations of workers were put together, it was Marxists, on the one hand, who were aiming at this interim period where the workers would dominate the previous landowners, and they would do it by means of control of the state. And in this period, for the Marxists, what needed to happen was a centralization and a consolidation of all property, all resources necessary for production, control of labor activity, development and usage of the land, development and usage of industry. This is what the Marxists were aiming for. And then the other biggest faction within the internationals were the anarchists. And the most prominent figure, Kropotkin was there, but the most prominent figure was a guy named Mikhail Bakunin, who we used to read in this class also, but I feel like a lot of the things that he has to say are anti-religion, and they sound a lot like Thomas Paine, so in a way we covered it. But Bakunin was this anarchist leader, which in a way is sort of an oxymoron. It's a paradox, because anarchists shouldn't have leaders. Anyway, Bakunin and Marx were vying for leadership of the International, and eventually Marx pushed Bakunin out, and at that point the International split. So my point is that in the latter half of the 1800s in Europe, there is real large-scale organized opposition to capitalism, therefore to existing regimes of property, to existing labor relationships, to the exploitation of workers, to the keeping of many people poor and working their entire life so that a very few people can live these affluent and super luxurious existences. And in that period of real organization, there are two primary variants, two leading ways of thinking about how to change the system, and one of them is Marxism and the other one is anarchism. For our class, these two things matter because the Marxist variant was dominant, pretty clearly dominant, from late 1800s, especially through, it's dominant through the first half of the 20th century, maybe later, 1968. I've used this year before. Like, let's call 1968 the shifting point. From, say, 1900 to 1968, Anarchism is still around, and it makes a number of appearances, and a lot of Marxist thinkers sort of defect along anarchist lines. But practical revolutionaries, Mao Zedong, Lenin, Che Guevara, they all preferred Marx. They thought that Marx was like the guidebook, especially because, even the anarchists agree that Marx's analysis of capitalism, why capitalism is bad, why it's a problem, how it's irrational, how it's founded on theft and exploitation, that analysis is agreed on by everybody, and this is part of the reason that Marxism is so influential. However, beginning around 1968, I think there's a kind of seismic change going on where, especially by the time we hit 1994, at which point the Zapatistas become public and come into networked connection with a whole bunch of different anti-globalization factions across the world. By that point, the anarchist model has become the dominant one. And there are all kinds of doubts about the wisdom of the Marxist model for a number of reasons. One, there's a profound distrust of centralization. And indeed, in the late 1800s, 1870s, Bakunin, he knew Marx. Marx and Bakunin knew one another. And Bakunin said to Marx at one point, look, if somebody carries out a revolution and follows your plan, what we're going to end up with is a specialized group at this hub who are determining what's going to happen with all the different industries, what's going to happen with all the different agriculture, how labor is going to be arranged, when and how military action is necessary. You're going to have this small elite group who are making these determinations, and that's just going to be another form of despotism. That's what Bakunin said. And in a lot of ways, that is what happened. That's what happened with the Soviet Union. Lenin carried out and we'll see this with Trotsky, he'll be the one who criticizes the Soviets for having done this, although I think he was fully complicit. Lenin led a revolution. Really, a whole lot of anarchists led the revolution, and then the Bolsheviks took over afterwards, dominated them by force, and centralized all these Soviets, all the communes, which otherwise had been actually self-directing and autonomous. And the result was a totalitarian state. Maybe not immediately. It's arguable, that under Lenin, there was a whole lot more freedom in Russia than there had been, for example, under the Tsar immediately before Lenin. But by the time that Stalin gets into power, late 1920s, it's pretty clear that Marx-style communism was not a free society. This is one of the reasons that anarchism has become a central go-to at this point in history. We'll talk more about this as we go on. Okay, so let me just take a few points from Lucy Parsons, and then I'll move on to Emma Goldman. If you read over these 4 or 5 pages that I gave you from Parsons, you'll see her talking about a few things, and I just want to point out a couple of them that I think directly bear upon us. She talks about homelessness. I mean, she uses the word tramps. She wants you to understand homelessness in a particular way. And the point that she wants to make about homelessness 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, I think is still perfectly valid today. And that is the conservative line. If you listen to Rush Limbaugh or something, he would have you understand homelessness as a personal failure. And I think there's a lot of tendency to do this. We see homeless people and we think, oh, they must have made really bad choices. Maybe they had a bad home life, but they probably got into drugs. They were not responsible, and look where it got them. The conservative angle on homelessness is that homelessness is an individual failure. And from that perspective, therefore, maybe we ought to be charitable because of our Christian feelings or something, but homelessness does not indicate a systemic problem, except insofar perhaps as it demonstrates a systemic failure of individuals to be responsible enough with their lives. The radical anarchist position, however, the class analysis position, says, no. When you see homelessness, and what are in Los Angeles now, 70,000, 80,000 homeless people, you're not looking at individual failures. You're looking at the character of the system itself. If we live in a system that allows 80,000 people to be without a home, to live in these squalid conditions, much worse than Syrian refugee camps. There's an outbreak of staph infection amongst homeless people in the past I don't know, 6 months or so in Los Angeles. A lot of people died because of totally unsanitary conditions. And this data got released about how many homeless people have to share something like, it was like 34,000 people have to share 8 bathrooms. And this is worse than a Syrian refugee camp. When you see things like that, when you see people turned into invisibles, turned into something less than people, and it's not that the higher ups do this exactly, it's that, you and I, we drive around and we ignore these people. They're all over the place. They're standing at intersections. They're sitting on the side of the road, and we sit in our car waiting for the light, and we're 5 feet away, and yet we don't like to look at them, and we don't look at them. We keep the windows rolled up. We listen to whatever we've got on the radio, and we live in a totally different world from this other person, even though we are separated by only 5 feet. It's the system that sets this stuff up, that allows 80,000 people in one city to exist in this way, while within the same city, how many people? 100 people have $1 billion, can fly anywhere in the world that they want. Their children will never have to work if they don't want. That's not individual failure. That is a token. It's a symbol. It's a reflection. It's a sign of the character of the overall capitalist system, which Parsons thinks is basically evil. Second point, the Haymarket massacre, which either an anarchist or just some other worker or an agent provocateur, somebody working for the police, threw a bomb, and this bomb became justification for the shooting of a whole bunch of strikers. And prior to this, in the lead up to Haymarket, police had killed 6 people who went on strike. So if you go back far enough, this is all around a particular plant, the McCormick plant. One owner makes a decision about his profit. This decision leads immediately to a decision to fire 4,000 of his workers. So now we have 4,000 people whose lives have become uncertain, the livelihood of whose family has been thrown into question, and they resist, throw a bunch of rocks at the building. Cops come out, kill 6 of them. Next day or 2, they have a protest, a gathering to decide what to do about this. That's the gathering where the bomb is thrown. More people get shot. Now, the position that Parsons takes about this stuff, now, and of course her husband, Albert Parsons, she's there, but Albert Parsons gets arrested, and along with 7 other people, is charged with basically inciting riot, speaking in such a way as to cause violence towards the police, and they're all killed. They're all executed. I mean, he didn't do it. He didn't throw the bomb. Nobody accused him of throwing the bomb. They basically accused him of being an anarchist, which he was. And he's executed. And Parsons goes on as an organizer. So she's a tough woman. Anyway, she makes a comment about the police killings here, which is indicative of a general anarchist position. What she says is like, look, I'm not celebrating the killing of police, but I'm not celebrating the killing of other people by police either. And what she says is like, when a bullet from a cop's gun kills another person, that's murder. In just the same way as when a bullet from a regular person's gun kills a cop. They're both murder. Now, hidden behind this is a typical and central anarchist position. What makes the state the state? If you go read Engels, Engels will say one of the key features of the state and the state apparatus is that it has a monopoly on legitimate violence. Meaning, we typically think when a regular person kills another person, that's murder. And the police ought to come and deal with that murderer. But when police kill somebody else, we tend to think, oh, well, perhaps they were provoked. They were probably just defending themselves. They were using force in the line of duty. They used force, perhaps, according to the rules established in their department, according to which they were trained. And if all of these things are defensible, that they used force according to pre-established guidelines, etc., then we don't want to call their bullet murderous. So regular people don't have a right to use violence in the same way that the state has a right to use violence. I don't think that's a contentious claim. We all sort of recognize that, right? So I'm not walking around carrying a gun, but every cop that you see in the United States is. And that's because the cop has a right to use the gun in the interest of maintaining order, or whatever you want to say. Whereas my right to use the gun is at least more limited. And of course, if I were a person of color, far more limited than it is now. If you think about these terrible things like, George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, etc., that practically speaking, there is this ongoing differentiation between who uses violence and whether it's going to be called violence. So the typical anarchist position is to refuse to distinguish, to say, look, I used to hear this joke because I lived in Chicago for a long time, where they'd say, hey man, what's the biggest gang in Chicago? And the answer was Chicago Police Department. That's a sort of anarchist position to say, look, the police force is just organized violence, just like a gang. There's really no difference between a gang and a police department. They're violent. Their violence is organized, but the anarchists refuse to accept this idea that the police, because they are the police, because they are affiliated with the state in these different ways, that their use of violence is legitimate. So when Lucy Parsons says a bullet from a police gun, when it hits another person and kills them, that's murder just like anything else, is really a refusal to accept the legitimacy of the state, a refusal to accept what the state is supposed to be, or understands itself to be, or is generally accepted to be, namely a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence. The state, it's different when they use violence, and the anarchists say, oh, it's not. It's not different. It's still murder. Okay, so I'll leave it there for Lucy Parsons. Now let me go on to Emma Goldman and Peter Kropotkin. The way I want to think about these two writers, speakers, is the text that I gave you from Lucy Parsons, I think, basically, it defines anarchism from a negative perspective. And I don't mean it makes anarchism look bad. I mean that it shows the primary things that anarchism is opposed to. Even its name, anarchism. So you have arche, Greek root, an, which means without. So anarche means without. This is like maybe a single organizing principle. So to begin with, even in its name, anarchism is understood as like a negative doctrine, meaning that it's characterized by opposition to particular things. And this is, it's true. Anarchism is opposed to some things, and the things that Goldman lists off are probably the primary ones. The main thing that anarchism is opposed to is the organizing principle will be the state. So anarchism is, in the simplest level, is that mathematical, like is sort of equal to opposition to government. And then she goes on and also talks about private property. And there is such a thing as Christian anarchism, although it's not a particularly dominant thing. So when she argues this other thing, she's not speaking for all anarchists, but it is a typical position, very much like Thomas Paine's, opposition to religion, and especially opposition to organized religion, because these are all forms of hierarchy. And anarchism is opposition to hierarchy. So we'll talk about Goldman. In order to define anarchism in a negative way, what does anarchism stand against? And then we'll go on and talk about Kropotkin to realize anarchism is not just a negative doctrine. It's not just opposition to certain things. It's also preference for a particular manner of social, political, and economic organization. And what is it that anarchists really want? Well, they want communes or collectives or councils, egalitarian, anti-hierarchical, and which then get into relationships of mutual aid with other such organizations. So you want communes in a federation and the absence of a state structure. The communes in federation ought to be working actively to oppose the emergence of state structures and hierarchy in general, both internally and externally. So this is what we're going to go on to. But let's go back to what are the things that anarchism is opposed to. For Goldman, it's God, state and government, and private property. Why? Why oppose especially God? I mean, first of all, in order to oppose God, which sounds like a ridiculous thing, especially if you're a religiously minded individual, like how can such a small person oppose the force which is infinite? And the first thing that you have to start realizing is that, well, of course, you know, along with Thomas Paine, we don't know that there is such a God. People take it on faith that there is such a God. But they don't really just take it on faith. They take it as hearsay from their families, from their surrounding communities, from their churches. So it's not really that they just take a leap of faith and believe that there's God. They're told for their entire lives that there is a God. Now, I can sort of testify here that the way that Goldman and a whole lot of other anarchists of this period think about God, what Goldman thinks is something that I went through too. So let me tell you my conversion experience to atheism. And a couple of things about that. I say conversion experience because I was raised Christian. I was raised United Methodist. My dad was a preacher. So we were at the church all the time. And I saw how, you know, the church is, it has a behind the scenes, you know, making the bulletins and doing the choir practice and planning out the sermons and all this sort of stuff. But I was raised to be a Christian and I took it quite seriously. You know, I was baptized. My dad wanted me to be the one who chose to be baptized. So when I was 13, basically in order to make him proud, I went ahead and did that. I was a Christian, roughly speaking. And then I went to college and I started reading stuff. And I was reading Nietzsche. We don't read Nietzsche in this class. We used to. You can fit Nietzsche into an Age of Revolt class. You know, he's like really antagonistic to a whole lot of commonsensical structures, a whole lot of standard social relationships he's opposed to. He actually hated Marxists and anarchists, but they have similar attitudes towards God. And Emma Goldman loved Nietzsche, by the way, and a whole lot of the early anarchist schools that she set up. They were called free schools or fairer schools, named after this Spanish anarchist educator. A lot of those schools involved the study of Nietzsche. So I had been reading Nietzsche, and I went on a road trip, and we were taking turns driving from Chicago out to California, and we were going really fast. I had done my shift driving. So I was laying in the back of this truck, like on top of all our luggage in the back, which is the only place there was for me. And I had a friend he had trouble seeing and it was dusk. And we're coming down this mountain into Reno. There's lots of wind and we're coming closer and closer to these semi-trucks. It's kind of scary. But what I'm laying there thinking about is this. First of all, recognize that you can't know that God exists. Nor can I know that God doesn't exist, right? So atheism is a faith position too. I can't prove it to you. But this was my thinking, and I think this is Emma Goldman's thinking. Whether or not I believe in God is an internal mental phenomenon because it's not obvious that God exists or that God doesn't exist. Basically, I'm involved in internal mental affirmations of one thing or another. Now, if I believe in God, that produces one structure in my thinking. If I disbelieve in God, it produces another structure in my thinking. What is this structure? If I believe in God, then every action that I do is being watched. Now, my belief in God does not make God exist, right? So the being watched is something that is happening mentally. I'm doing it to myself. You could put this in Freudian language really easily. Belief in God strengthens the super ego. So everything that I do is being monitored and compared to a moral script. And I have the idea that I'm being watched at all times. And I'm inhibiting my actions so as to hope to avoid sin and censure by this God. To believe in God is to construct within your own behavior and in your own thinking a situation that is self-limiting. By believing in God, you limit the range of your action and the range of your powers. And I was thinking, okay, so I can do that, which I have been doing to this point in my life. Or what would happen if I denied the existence of God? Well, if I denied the existence of God, it seems that I open up more range for the exploration of what my powers really are, for the exploration of what my mind can really think, for the exploration of what pleasure can be, what social relationships can be, what social order can be. In the absence of God, if I construct that mental structure, I have freed my powers to a greater degree. And this is sort of what Goldman and what Nietzsche say. Goldman says, if there's a God, then all humans are slaves. But all humans must be free, therefore there is no God. And she's sort of paraphrasing Mikhail Bakunin here too. If there's a God, I have constructed myself as the sort of being that is always in an inferior position. I'm always, here's God. And here's me. This is superior. This is inferior. There's no way to believe in God unless you become super pantheistic and mystic. And I personally am fairly sympathetic to that stuff. There's no way traditionally to believe in God without also constructing yourself as a fundamentally inferior sort of being. And so the anarchist view on this is like, well, of course, hierarchical state systems always ally themselves with the church, with the priest, with a doctrine about God, because this is one key way in which they produce their individuals, the people who are under control, as subjects. To be a subject means not only to be subject to the ruling of the government, but it's also a psychological and behavioral position. The anarchists don't want to be in that position because there's this huge emphasis upon freedom. And freedom seems to be antagonistic to this whole picture. So we're going to get rid of this. Now that's quite a daring move, right? And it's not the only one. Secondly, anarchists are by definition opposed to the state and government. To be an anarchist means to want to live without government. This means without a separate state structure. Now notice, this is sort of similar to the God scenario I just drew you. So here's the population, and above it, there's the state structure, or the state apparatus. And this includes police, army, judicial system, prisons, legislative system, executive branch. From an anarchist or Marxist point of view, and I think from an honest point of view actually, if you have a state structure, you have hierarchy, and you have a sort of external entity which appears rather like a parasitic growth upon the body politic. If the state is in place, then all kinds of things that human beings could do are disallowed. And the decision making of the population now is going to be made up here. Now, of course, in our parliamentary democratic systems, our representative democratic systems, we would like to believe that especially this here, actually only this, well, and a linkage to this one, that these emerge from the will of the population. And then all of these things, the police, the army, the prison system, are used only in accord with the will of the general population. So you could argue for a legitimate state situation. Of course, once you have representatives, it looks like the representatives may well just act for themselves. And of course, back here is really the owners, the capitalists. And if you think about it, the capitalists are really not subject to the same system of oppression as everybody else. What was that kid? Some kid, what did he get, drunk or high? And he ran over some people in his car, and then the judge ruled that, like, well, this poor kid was so damn rich that he didn't know right from wrong, and so he had to be let go. He had affluenza. I mean, that's like a sort of caricatured example of what does happen on a regular basis. You know, rich person gets pulled over for whatever, snorting coke in their car, partying. They go to jail, maybe for an hour or two, and their lawyer shows up, their badass lawyer who knows everybody and knows the judge and golfs with the judge, and they're out. And it may well be that this gets wiped from their record entirely. They're certainly not going to go spend 3 years in jail for this stuff, because their position allows them to escape. So the state, as a repressive apparatus, does not bear upon everyone, does not bear upon the super rich. It bears upon the poor. And as such, it's a system of oppression. So the anarchists want to say, look, this is hierarchy, and hierarchy is not consistent with the freedom of the general population. If this population wants really to be free, if it wants really to recognize its human nature, and there is this kind of, like, you know, almost romantic set of beliefs coming in large part from Rousseau in both Marxism and anarchism, where they really believe, you know, humans are fundamentally free. We have to be able to determine our own actions, and we have to do that in such a way that we build our powers, and ultimately our freedom is not fundamentally limited by our neighbors, or maybe sometimes by our neighbors, but it's not fundamentally limited by other people. We just have to find the other people who we fit with, and then actually other people allow us to grow our power. This is a position that I'm pretty darn committed to. Anyway, the existence of this whole thing inhibits this freedom. And so the radical anarchist response is like, well, let's get rid of that. And this can take a number of different forms. So anarchists do, on occasion, go head-to-head with the cops. You can see this especially in, like, anti-austerity protests, say in Greece and in Rome and in Italy in general, and in Ireland and in Spain. You know, there's tons of, especially Spain, Italy, Greece, there are massive anarchist organizations, and they do square off with the police. But there's an element of kind of like performance to this too, because there's not much possibility that the anarchists are really going to overcome the police in those circumstances. They throw Molotov cocktails, which in the US would get them shot. It doesn't there, but they don't actually try to kill the police. There are instances where anarchists do fight against state forces. Syrian civil war is one example, and Rojava, where we're going to end up. Spanish Civil War is another one. But there are other ways to oppose the state apparatus, and I think this is the model that I really want to think about the most, and the one that I'm most interested in. This dual power model, where instead of just trying to destroy the state forces, maybe what we really need to be doing is establishing free territories where state forces are not operative. So if you can work out ways for a neighborhood to police itself, and so people know that they can be safe by calling on their neighbors, then you call the police less, and the police will come to your neighborhood less, and you will effectively have a freer, more self-governed situation. Same thing for all kinds of stuff. Anyway, so anarchism does involve an opposition to God, an opposition to the state and government, and then, of course, just like the Marxist, and here the analysis is entirely the same as the Marxists, there's an opposition to private property. Now remember what private property was. It was not my having my, like, nice Maui Jim sunglasses. It's me, at the bottom level, it's me owning my neighbor's house. It's me having, so private property, Marx famously says, private property is a social relation. Meaning, you know, like the classic way of thinking about private property in John Locke or Adam Smith or something, they want to think about private property as being, it's just a relationship between an individual and stuff. And, you know, their whole idea is that, like, the government ought not to get in between me and my Maui Jim sunglasses. Marx is not interested in personal property. This is not what fits under the term private property. Private property starts at a certain level, and that level is exactly where my owning certain things is really my having a right to exploit other people. So if I own another house and I rent it out, that legally gives me the right to take the living allowance of people who are in a less privileged position than me and convert that money. It gives me access to that money, which I then put into my bank and put against my mortgage in order to build my equity while they stay on a month-to-month basis. That's what private property is. Private property is the owning of factories, for example, where thousands of people, perhaps, have to come work because without prostituting themselves to the owners, going and doing whatever they're told all day long, being treated like an object, being purchased like an object, without doing that, they cannot feed themselves or their family. They are in a subservient position. And what they are subservient to is the person who does have the ability to do those things for themselves and controls access to money and food for everybody else. Private property is a control over access to the needed things of life by a small population. So here's the capitalists, the owners. And you can say like down here is like petty bourgeois. You know, the person who owns one other house, the person who owns like a little shop. And eventually they tend to go down here to the proletariat. Private property is not just what these people own, it is this relationship. Because they're controlling access to money. These people have no money, and so they have to go over here to get it. But in order to get it, they have to do what these people say. They have to work all day, they have to enslave themselves. Then they get some of this money, and they bring it back to live, but oh wait, no, they had to pay it to the landlord, to the grocery store, to the cell phone company, etc. And they end up right back where they started, poor, and having to go somewhere to be paid, which means go behave as a servant in order just to get access to the means of life. Capitalism is a system which makes this the rule for everyone. So, and this of course is a hierarchical relationship. And from the anarchist perspective, it is incommensurate with freedom. So a person like this can't be free. They'd like us to believe that we're free in our off hours, right? That's when I get to watch. I've been watching Peaky Blinders, which my wife thinks is like some kind of dude show that she doesn't want to watch. We're supposed to believe that the fact that we can go home at night and sit down and watch television, that's freedom. The anarchist, the Marxist view on this is like, that is a pretty damn paltry version of freedom, where you get to sit still and be passive for a moment until you have to go and surrender your decision-making power, surrender your physical power, surrender the use of your body and your time and your energy to somebody else. You know, say this is like Exxon, you know, or it's like, oh, my extended family, they all work for Nationwide Insurance. This is pretty paltry excuse for freedom. Now these people, they have a far greater degree of freedom. You know, on the one hand, they have like negative freedoms, to go back to Hannah Arendt's language. You know, they can move wherever they want. They have no obstacles. But they also have positive freedom. They get to act. They get to decide. By nature, according to Goldman, individuals are free and individuals are social. But when you put a state in place, the freedom of individuals is fundamentally inhibited, and the sociality of human beings is interfered with, where we could have had relationships of mutual trust, mutual recognition, mutual respect. Instead, now we have the cop who has the right to take you and slam you on your car and bust your face and put your hands behind your back and kick the shit out of you. And instead of solidarity and mutual respect between people, we have the homeless person who becomes invisible, and the rich person who never even has to drive down the same streets where these homeless people live, because they travel everywhere by helicopter. So instead of the state being premised on natural laws, she says it's actually in violation of nature, and especially of human nature. Secondly, she says, okay, a lot of people will say, but you know, without the state, there's no order. The state brings order. Without that, we're going to have chaos, and everybody's going to kill everybody else. She's like, okay, first of all, it's illegitimate to think that any kind of order is impossible without hierarchy. Human beings have, and here I'm speaking beyond what she says, but I think the principle is that human beings have organized themselves throughout for 100,000 years. We don't actually have to have a state in order to organize ourselves. It's not like there will be an absence of order. There'll just be a different order without the state. And let's think about the variety of order that the state establishes. She says the order that the state establishes is an order based on terror. The ultimate wild card of the state, that upon which the state is built. And this is true if you read super conservative commentators, like we used to in this class too, like Burke or Joseph de Maistre, Edmund Burke, Joseph de Maistre. These were radical opponents of the French Revolution. And de Maistre will go ahead and say, civilization is founded upon the executioner. The fundamental power that the state has is the power to kill you. It's the power to incarcerate you. Now, what kind of order is that? That's terrorism. All of the order, the allegedly benevolent, beneficent order that the state brings to us is premised upon the use of raw violence and organized force. So what's the difference between living under a state and living under the rule of a gang? Nothing. So the fact that the state brings order is not a good thing. It's the kind of order that the state brings that is a problem. What about people will say, well, but without a government, there'll be so much crime. Goldman's got two responses to this. She'll say, oh, and by the way, I'm pretty much following the notes on Goldman here. She'll say, well, look, first of all, we need a redefinition of crime. Think about like the conservative attitude towards crime. What would Rush Limbaugh tell us about crime? Crime, just like homelessness, is an individual failure. It's an individual choice. And people who engage in such things deserve whatever they get because they knew it was wrong, but they were too lazy and morally destitute to do the right thing. They preferred to do the lazy thing and the sleazy thing, and screw them, they should go to jail. And probably we need more jails because there's so many people like this. This is typical conservative attitude towards crime. The typical lefty attitude towards crime is completely different. So Goldman says, well, crime is just misdirected energy. When you have conditions which bear upon particular sets of people, and particularly the poor, in really aggressive ways, the product is going to be violence and theft and crime in various ways. You have to understand crime as a byproduct of an unequal system. It's not just something that people individually do. In fact, there's very little that people just individually do. Everything takes place in a context, and therefore there are circumstantial causes for everything that happens. But then, secondly, she thinks that people who say, well, the state is necessary to keep crime down are themselves involved in a self-contradiction. Because who's the biggest criminal of all? The state is. Who murders more than anybody else? Armies. There's no such thing as like a standing army without a state structure, at least not in our world. In our society, you take people who you morally educated within the civilized circumstance, and then you set them loose on other people and you tell them that they're not people. They're Hajis, they're not people. They're terrorists, they're not people. And then you unteach all the moral inhibitions that you previously taught. So now they're free to kill anybody that they want, rape anybody that they want. And if you don't believe that this happens, read in a little bit more detail about, say, like the My Lai massacre, or there's a really good book called, Trained to Kill, by a guy named Pelton, which is pretty good about talking about these things, the ways in which martial situations unleash these tremendous amounts of violence. It's the state that does this stuff. The state is involved in taking people to black sites. The state is involved in torture. So this thing that is supposed to be anti-crime is actually the perpetrator of the greatest crimes that the world knows of. And this is a fact. Maybe torture happens in organized crime. But again, there's very little difference between organized crime and a state. There's just, an official outfit that the state wears. But the vast majority of torture that does and has taken place in the world takes place on the agent of this torture is the state and state forces. Police, soldiers, special forces, intelligence officers, and oftentimes in our case, it'll be like CIA directors or CIA advisors acting together with the proxy government of one or another country. El Salvador, Honduras, Chile, Argentina, all over Africa. The United States will put experts about interrogation in place to make sure that torture takes place, and then they'll have the actual torture done by basically their hirelings in these subservient countries. So some people think that the state is necessary in order to avoid crime. Goldman thinks the state is actually the perpetrator of the greatest crimes on the planet. Without state structures, there could be no world war. Truman, go read or go watch Oliver Stone's, The Untold History of the United States, and look at specifically the World War II stuff. I think it gets kind of sucky after that, but I've read a decent amount about this, and I think he's right. Truman didn't have to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to defeat the Japanese. The Japanese were already falling apart, and there was a Soviet invasion prepared to come from the north. So all this stuff that we say about how it was necessary to use nuclear weapons in order to preserve American troops who otherwise would have died in vast numbers when they invaded Japan, that's just a falsification. Probably American forces wouldn't have had to go in at all because the Soviets were going to go in, and this is what Truman wanted to avoid. So first of all, we had destroyed in Dresden, all across Germany and all across Japan, every single Japanese city was targeted. So those are civilian populations were targeted in firebombing attacks, and they turned cities in Japan into vast ovens. People were cooked. People were vaporized. This is prior to nuclear weapons. So this tremendous amount of devastation. I mean, there are people like Robert McNamara at that time were working at Harvard in order to, in this pseudo-mathematical way, to try and develop dependable ratios between bomb tonnage and drops in enemy morale, which meant how many people, how many civilians, how many children do we have to kill in order for the Japanese army to become less effective? That's a state enterprise. And then the use of nuclear weapons was a gesture to keep the Soviets at bay. It was supposed to affect the balance of power coming out of the war. And this is what it did. It led to the Cold War and the arms race. Without state structures, you would probably not have the development of an arms race. You wouldn't have 10,000 nuclear devices sitting across the face of the globe waiting to destroy that globe. At this point in history, the state, which is supposed to be anti-crime, has set up the physical possibility and a lot of the structural possibilities for the absolute extermination of the entirety of the human race and maybe all other living things on the planet. So don't speak to Emma Goldman about the state's ability to suppress crime when the state is the only entity or type of entity on the face of the earth ever to make the crime of the genocide of all life possible. They're the criminals. The state is the real criminal. Oh, and then lastly, she says, well, if you didn't have the government, people will say, if you didn't have the government, that would let lazy people just go on being lazy, and they would mooch off of everybody else. And of course, there's conservative arguments about this too, right? That we ought not to have welfare programs. Some people think because welfare programs incentivize laziness. They allow people to sit still and not develop themselves. Now, of course, there's all kinds of responses just to that, by the way. So I got a Swiss friend who's been telling me about direct democracy there. They have begun implementing a living wage in Switzerland. So they did a study with a small group of people, a few hundred, and they gave them all a living wage for a certain period of time. And then they looked at, did these people become lazy? And systematically, no. They all worked. They used the greater freedom they had because of their economic security in order to educate themselves, in order to do internships where otherwise they couldn't have, so that they could get into the line of work they really wanted. So there are arguments against the idea that welfare produces laziness. But anyway, Goldman's response is are you kidding me? You want to keep private property and the government in place in order to avoid laziness? But what the capitalist system, together with its armed wing, the state, actually achieves is the production and defense of a lazy class. Rich people are the laziest people there are. They don't have to work. Their children don't have to work. People who ride on inheritances, which now, of course, that the tax plan is passed, so we're going to not have inheritance taxes anymore. This is a way to build aristocracy. I mean, we already have something like that, but it's going to go even faster. So as certain families develop bigger and bigger fortunes, this allows them to live in any way they see fit. And contributing to society, working together with their neighbors, is not on the list. Traveling by sailboat for 2 years straight, there's something that rich people might like. Flying every weekend to another part of the globe in order to be handed the product of the labor of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people so that they can consume it and maybe dump it on the floor and maybe throw it in the trash eventually. That's what capitalism, private property, and the government allows. It actually produces and sustains a whole class of people, smallish class, who are in charge of everything, who are the laziest people who ever lived. Okay, so these are her responses. Now lastly, let me go on to Peter Kropotkin. As I said, I think what Goldman did was to give us the list of things to which anarchism is opposed. What Kropotkin gives us is what anarchism wants. What do anarchists want? Because they don't just want the abolition of these nasty things. They want to establish a specific thing on their own. And this thing is communes in federation. Okay, so one of the texts, I gave you two texts from Kropotkin. One is the anarchist idea, and the other one is the medieval and the modern commune. So maybe I'll just touch on the anarchist idea real quick. In it, he's basically starting to tell people, how do we move towards the system that he wants? And he's like, okay, for now, we got to do propaganda and agitation, and we got to study. But what you're really looking for is any moment where, on a local basis, without overall large-scale leadership. So here's a big difference between the anarchists and the Marxists. The anarchists are for decentralization. They're for spontaneous initiative on the basis of every locality. Wherever possible, you should expropriate the means of production. That means steal, from a legal perspective, steal what it is that allows the necessities of life to be generated. So classically, the clearest example of the things that should be expropriated are land. So when the Zapatista rebellion becomes public in 1994, they take over a whole bunch of ranch land. That is expropriation. It's like we're gonna not recognize the power and the legitimacy of the state, the power and the legitimacy of private property. In place of those things, we are going to recognize our own rights, our own power, our own needs, and the right of individuals to live. Go back to Robespierre, right? If I have a right to life, I also have a right to the means of life. And if the rich people around me, together with their colleagues in the police department, are going to prevent us from having access to the means of life, they have done away with our right to life, and we have the right to take it back. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine would probably have agreed with these things. Okay, so then what is it that Kropotkin wants us to do? Well, here's two ways of looking at it. Let's say this is a commune. What's a commune? A commune is any situation where multiple people work or live together on an egalitarian basis, where, here's the socialist rule, where each works according to their capacity, from each according to her ability, to each according to her needs. So everybody they just pitch in, they do whatever they can, and they get everything that they need. So classically, historically, a commune was a society for mutual self-defense. Like, I promise to support you and to defend you, and you promise to support and defend me. But it's got to be egalitarian. So, no hierarchy. Everything has to be shared in common. If you're talking about a workplace, on the anarchist model, a pure communal workplace, ultimately everybody has to learn every job at that workplace, because you don't want people to get stuck in particular positions, because then certain people are going to have control over other people. And in the background, when there are these relationships of control, the freedom of individuals and the sociality of individuals is inhibited. You're inhibiting the full growth of human potential. In that case, you facilitate that growth only by putting people in absolutely equal relationships. How do you do that in a shop? Everybody has to rotate jobs. Everybody takes part in deciding what is going to be produced. If we've got a hybrid situation where the shop is still producing for a capitalist market, then everybody takes part in deciding where the raw materials are going to be got from, because that's a tough one, right? Because maybe you're like the textile manufacturers in New England that Thoreau was pissed off at. Maybe you're supporting slavery over there. So we got to have discussions about this. If there's profit coming in, that profit has to be shared absolutely equally. That's a commune. And then the idea is that the commune needs to make connections with other communes. So in order for a shop to run, for example, it needs raw materials. Where's it going to get those raw materials? It should be from another shop that's run according to the same lines. And the idea is that a commune can't just last by itself. This is Kropotkin's comments on the medieval versus the modern commune. The medieval commune, and I'll go back and talk about that in a second, the medieval commune sought to be independent, and it stayed by itself. That can't work today. What needs to happen is that, say, on this economic plane, raw materials, products that are shipped for sale, exchange of information. Ideally, these exchanges should take place between like-minded groups. So in general, you could call these relationships mutual aid. And they should not be for-profit relationships. They should be mutually supportive relationships. Ideally, if we have a surplus over here, we should give it to these people, because we know that our strength depends upon this federation. So communes in federation. And really, if you think, this is like the diagram that I tried to make on the page. Let's see if I can make it here. This kind of, call it like a ramification or an amplification of federations. It ought to happen on multiple planes. So here's my attempt to draw multiple planes. Multiple planes, like I just drew an economic mutual aid network, but now you can imagine the people who are involved in this commune, maybe they also have intellectual interests and sports interests. And so you can get another network of communes going on here, which are, say, like, intellectual groups. And actually what will happen is that these become their own communes. So a group of people that gets together in order to study revolutionary history can be a commune, provided that they behave in an egalitarian way. They do away with hierarchy wherever possible. They seek to engage in mutually supportive relationships with other such groups. So you want to build, this is becoming a mess, but you get the idea. You want to build out in every possible dimension towards a federation. So let me draw what the federation might look like. And this is all, these diagrams are in your notes too, if they don't make any sense here. I think this is the basic anarchist model. So here's our network, our federation of economic communes. So these can be factories. They can also be, say, living places. So you can make a commune, you can make a collective, you can build popular grassroots power, not only by expropriating the place of work, and that's what he's recommending. The workers should take over the workplace. We don't want any managers, and we don't believe in the external landlord. Screw that person. They're not here. They've been dominating us and living off of our profit for long enough. Let's take the means of production and make them our own. So this is an illegal act in many cases. But it's not only the factory, it could also be where you live. So contemporary terms, the anarchists really have to support things like tenants unions, where the people who live together in a particular place get together in order to support themselves and push against the owner of that place. The end game of this, what should really happen as far as anarchists are concerned, and Kropotkin's like, you just have to do this wherever circumstances permit. For example, in Rojava, there was all kinds of expropriation and all sorts of communalization. Rojava is where we end in this class, so this is a real thing happening right now. And so the Zapatistas. That was possible because of the Syrian civil war. So a whole bunch of state-run factories were just abandoned. And so it was easy for them to get started on this level. That's circumstances, right? Kropotkin's like, just make use of circumstances and do this wherever possible. But also the places where you live. And say you live in an apartment building. Ideally, if you're lucky enough to have formed relationships of solidarity with your neighbors, if the political climate is not going to get you all shot immediately, ideally, you ought to take over your apartment building. That would be a commune if you ran it along egalitarian lines. So let's say that there are territorially based communes in federation. So they're forming all kinds of links with one another. And it should be decentralized. These all support one another. And this is, by the way that they're going to push back against the forces of capitalists, private property, the police, armies, etc. They're going to do it by supporting one another. But then in addition, we're going to have non-territorially based communes. This, by the way, matches almost exactly what I think Hannah Arendt says existed in the United States during its revolution and in France during its revolution. In France in particular, in Paris, there were the communes, or there were the sections, the 48 sections of the Paris Commune, which initially had been established in order to send representatives to the assembly, but it didn't really function that way. What happened was that each one of those sections became a self-governing forum for everybody who lived in this portion of the city. But in addition to that, in France, you also had what were called popular societies. Here, I think our contemporary language, we would call these affinity groups, meaning they're groups of like-minded individuals. Anarchists are all for voluntary association. We should hang out with the people who make us feel good, the people who grow our powers, the people who show us respect. Like, we should select the people we want to be with. And what that results in is a whole bunch of, so you get these popular societies, which might be like, study groups. And they're going to involve, really, individuals from a whole bunch of different communes. And this is one way in which the communes will come into closer contact with one another. You're building social solidarity. I mean, social solidarity is absolutely central. Meaning relationships of trust, respect, and mutual aid between individuals and between groups within the society. So maybe you have a study group. Maybe this is like, sports club. Maybe this is like, just, I don't know, people who like to cook. But then you can also have much more like serious ones. Like this one could be a militia. And its job is to train people up to be able to meet threats to this general confederacy, right? So you're drawing people from different territorially based communes in order to build things like non-territorial affinity groups, which are still based on the same lines: egalitarian, non-hierarchical, total respect for everybody. They got to be non-racist, they got to be non-sexist, all the rest. And then the general idea is that these scattered and grassroots controlled collectives, where it's just the membership that makes decisions, they are going to send representatives. Both the territorial and the non-territorial collectives are going to send representatives, or let's call them delegates, to something like a federal assembly. Now, this is starting to look like, a very rough model of like the US, right? Which is itself a federal system. But there are many differences. First of all, there have to be a lot of rules about these representatives. These representatives cannot be professional. They can't be permanent. Say they hold this office for like a year, and they have to be recallable. So instead of sending a bunch of professional representatives, congresspeople and senators, to a special place where they hang out, and then of course in DC, of course, the money is impacting their actions all the time. We don't want that. We're going to send individuals who have no power. They have no power. They're performing a service for the Federation and for the collectives. And that service is to just deliver a message from this particular commune. That's their whole power. Like, this is what our people think about whatever issue it is. This is what we think we ought to do about, in Rojava, this is what we think we ought to do about ISIS. This is what we think we ought to do about Turkey. This is what we think we ought to do about the United States. This is what we think we ought to do about Russia. This is what we think we ought to do about the energy problem, etc. So this system really exists. Something very similar to this exists with the Zapatistas, and something almost identical to this exists in Rojava. And there are other places too. So these representatives are non-professional. They can only deliver a message. And then you have a discussion. So, you do get a concentration of the points of view of all these different collectives or communes. And then, an ability to compare those positions. And you can have discussion, but you can't make a decision. Once the discussion takes place and everybody understands everybody else's point of view, each one of these delegates goes back to their grassroots membership. Same thing for representatives from a particular Zapatista autonomous community send representatives to a general assembly. They discuss, and then they come back to the grassroots and they say, okay, so this is what's going on. These people want this, and these ones want this, and they have this consideration, and they have a problem they have to deal with first. What do you think we should do? And then they make another decision, and they percolate it up. So this is potentially a slower process, but it's an actually democratic process. So this is the model that anarchists want. At least that anarcho-communists, anarcho-socialists, which is like the real heart of this movement. And I'm distinguishing, like libertarian anarchists who are closer to libertarian than they are to anarchists. This, generally speaking, is what anarchism is on a positive level. So it's not just opposition to God, the state, and private property. It's a preference for free association, absolute local control, non-hierarchy, mutual aid, respect, and so on. And this recall, this is an important thing. Say one of these individuals decides to go to the assembly and they just start making decisions for themselves. They start like arguing on behalf of these people over here because they've got like a secret friendship, and this guy's gonna give money to this guy if he says what these people want. And so maybe you start to get hierarchy growing. This collective notices that's what this dude is doing. Bam, he's out. Can't have that job anymore. Maybe he has to get out of the damn commune too, right? So the power is kept at the low level in every instance. So maybe the last thing I'll say is that Kropotkin thinks, of course he thinks this is a work in progress, and a typical anarchist view versus a Marxist view is that we can't just have some like really smart people like Lenin or Trotsky be in charge of everything and decide what plan is the revolution going to take, and then we should just listen to them. Because either, the problem number one is that nobody can really know right now how shit is going to go down within a year. We have to experiment. We have to try out experiments in freedom, experiments in autonomous control, experiments in free living. And in a year, the situation is going to be so different that we're going to have to make new decisions then. So there's a belief in creativity and a belief in spontaneity and a belief that there's a modesty. We just can't know what's going to happen, but we can know what's right. And the anarchists want to get to their goal right away. The Marxists, they sound like Malcolm X in this, by any means necessary. They're going to do all kinds of stuff that involves hierarchy, that involves domination, in order to allegedly get to a place where eventually people are going to be free. The anarchists are like, I don't trust that shit. If you put like domination in place, if you put the rule of violence in place, if you put a particular expert elite in charge, that will inertially stay in place and it will augment itself. And this is, go read Trotsky, this is what happens to the Soviet Union. So we want to build, it's like Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world. That's the anarchist motto. You have to do through direct action, not indirect action. You don't beg powers to do it for you. You have to build the solidarity you want to see. You have to build the local control that you want to see. You have to build the territorial control that you want to see. You have to build the opposition to police violence that you want to see. You have to do it yourself, or else it's never going to happen. And it should always be the case that your means match your ends. On this level, arguably, anarchism is a more moral and ethical revolutionary system or revolutionary project than, say, like, Soviet-style communism. Last comment. So Kropotkin knows that this is all experimental, that this is going to go in fits and starts, and that like sometimes there will be an expropriation of a factory and then those workers are going to all get imprisoned or shot. But he's like, actually in the long run that's good, because the fact that they did it shows that it can be done. And in another historical moment, one where the state has been weakened by a financial collapse or by a drought or by defeat in a war, and these are some of the typical times when revolutions happen, when the state is weakened. There are real times when the power of the state is weakened. If there's a history of autonomization happening, even if it failed, that will contribute to the capacity for autonomization. Autonomization, autonomos, means self-law-giving. Autonomization means like you make it so that whoever's there is determining things for themselves. If there's a history of autonomization, it makes autonomization more possible in the present, if only because there's a knowledge on the part of people that this really can be done. It has been done. Okay, last comment. What is it? So it's not a utopian model. It's not saying like if we all just like decide this right now, it's going to be peaceful and everybody's going to be happy. No. Nor does Kropotkin have the delusion that you can get rid of the tendency to domination. And of course, like as Rousseau said, there's natural inequality, right? Some people are faster than other people. That's just a fact. Some people can lift more stuff than other people. That's just a fact. Some people can calculate way faster than other people. That's just a fact. Some people are really pleasant to look at, and some people not so much. Some people are charming to listen to, and other people not so much. Some people are very charismatic, and other people have this kind of gruff temperament that puts people off. These are all facts. So it's natural, if you like that term, that within a commune, a movement away from equality is always going to be possible. And between communes, it'll always be possible that one or another faction, sitting on better resources, with a greater population, whatever, will start to move into a position of ascendancy. And once such a commune, once such a section of the population gets into a position of domination, the anarchist observation is they're going to want to stay there. They're going to think this is the best. But what you have to do at both places, there has to be this regular work. He doesn't think we're going to get to a full-on anarchist federation anytime soon necessarily. He sort of would like it. But the work that we would have to do is a work of avoiding the development of state structures, avoiding the development of hierarchy, wherever and however they appear. So within the small collective, within the affinity group, within the worker-run shop. And these are the sorts of things that they want, like egalitarian, voluntary associations, groups of people who freely get together and nobody's in charge, they share duties, and also worker-run shops. Within those individual collectives, those individual communes, there has to be ongoing work to look out for different forms of domination. That means we always have to be working on ourselves. We probably never get to experience real, total equality, but we do have to be looking out for, hey, look, in our group, it looks like the men are always talking and the women aren't. How are we going to get around this? Because if the men are always talking and the women aren't, we have a power relationship here. That means that the men are determining more things. That means that the men are getting to express themselves more fully. That means that the men are getting more respect because people are hearing their voices, but not those of the women. An unequal relationship between men and women in a group is a fundamental problem that has to be addressed immediately. Relationships between races that are not equal and respectful have to be addressed. Relationships where 2 or 3 people are like the most enthusiastic, the most charismatic, and everybody else just sort of sits there. That shit has to be addressed, or else you just lost your commune. This seed, the affinity group, is sort of the seed of all organizing. There's actually a group in 1968, anarchist group, basically a commune, that was called Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker. That was taken from a Leroy Jones poem. And they say, arguably, they come up with the term affinity group, which later this guy named Murray Bookchin uses. They say the affinity group is the germ cell of all organizing. A few people who are bound by ties of love and mutual respect and shared experience, where they trust one another. This could be 3, 4 people, it could be 20 people, probably can't be 100 people. It's got to be small scale. Groups like this are the germ cell of organization, and they have to be kept free of power relationships. Or rather, maybe you never get free of power relationships, but there has to be ongoing work in order to equalize these situations, to make them truly democratic. And this is not something tedious or unovercomable for people like Kropotkin. This is like good human ethical practice. This is what we want anyway, because I'm not really going to be able to live my freedom and my sociality and my human nature unless I exist in an equal relationship with you. Parenthesis, that also is another reason that me doing video lectures on my porch is fucked up, and that me being the professor of this class in itself is fucked up, and the power that I have to give you grades that you don't have over me is fucked up. These are all, from this perspective, these are all inhibitions. They're all limitations to us as a group really realizing our full humanity, our power, our freedom, our free will, our reason. All these things will really be nurtured best just in case we do away with or we minimize these power differentials. So the end point for this class is where you guys get together and you figure out how to push back against me, or just ask me. If you actually do any work together, you want to change the structure of the course, for example, I'll do it because my sympathies actually lie in this direction. But if we don't achieve such things, then you can talk radical all day long, and we can explore this radical history all day long, but we will have been ritually practicing domination. And so while you might have like radical ideas coming out, you're going to have conservative dominated habits coming out. So every single situation can be democratized, can be autonomized, and that's what we need to be doing. And then also on the large scale, at the federal level, we need to watch out for groups that are becoming ascendant. And when those groups become ascendant and they are exercising more control than any other group, then we need to interrupt them. And how do we do that? We do it by forming alliances among the other groups. So there's a continual jockeying, and there's like a kind of like pluralistic open debate, but there's also like a fluctuating field of power forces, power relations going on in the Federation at all times. We cannot expect everybody to just stay equal. There's always going to be some emergence of some dominant sector, and then all the other ones have to operate together to be like, whoa there, let's keep you out of control. We'll show you respect. You have as much voice as everybody else, but not more. Not more.